Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I greet you in peace. Welcome to Isuron's Facebook. Let me first thank God for everything we got, such as community, friends, and family. Let me also send shout out to all Muslims who are celebrating the ending of fasting month, Ramadan. And I ask God to accept all of our prayers and our wishes, and may we all be recipient of Allah's mercy and forgiveness. Let me introduce you my two co-hosts, Elizabeth Glitton and Michelle. Please welcome.
So thanks very much, Fartun. We're here. We're trying the Facebook Live. We're trying to get out our nerves, but I'm here. I'm Elizabeth Glidden. Fartun and I have known each other many years together. Michelle and I have more recently gotten to know each other. And today I work at the Minnesota Housing Partnership. I'm the policy director there. Minnesota Housing Partnership is an organization that works on improving home and community. We work on state, federal, and local affordable housing policy, and we work closely with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, which is an organization that works on the needs of those with the very lowest incomes and how we make sure policy is serving those folks. We also do some original research, and we also provide some assistance directly to communities, Native communities, and rural communities around the nation.
Super. Michelle.
Yay. So thank you. My name is Michelle Rivero, and I'm with the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for the City of Minneapolis. My office is a new office. It's been in existence for about 10 months. And part of the purpose of the office is to make sure that immigrant and refugee communities have access to information that is so important, especially during these challenging times. In the area of immigration, of course, housing concerns, discrimination, human trafficking. And in the 10 months that I've been working with the city, I communicate with individuals and groups through community immigration forums, where we invite immigration attorneys and nonprofit organizations to speak to community members about changes that we're seeing in the immigration landscape and how people can be prepared. We also bring city offices to communities, so working in trusted community organizations and bringing people like attorneys from the Civil Rights Department or our senior advisor on human trafficking to talk to people about the services that the city has to offer, and also to help connect people to resources, including immigration attorneys and other attorneys in the Twin Cities area. Our office also puts out a monthly immigration bulletin so that community is aware of immigration events and also changes that are taking place on the immigration landscape. We also have a website where we have information about a variety of different things, steps that the city is taking to be more welcoming. There's also information about community resources that are available. And part of my job also is to study immigration changes on a federal level and make sure that our elected representatives on the city level are aware of these changes and are working proactively to create policies and programs that support our immigrant and refugee communities.
Wow.
So that was a lot. No, that's all right.
No, don't be.
But
Share information.
this is a new office at the city, and it's really important that the community knows this is a place to get resources. And we're trying to do something a little bit different here by just showing what are some of these connections that happen between communities around housing needs. And I'm going to turn to Fartun a little bit for direction, because we're also thinking with this event, trying Facebook Live. You know, we do some communication in English and some communication directly to community in Somali. And so, Fartun, I don't know if you want to share some of those messages that we did about ourselves, and then we talk after that a little bit about the National Housing Week of Action.
So what I want to say is that everything that was said, if I try to explain in Somali, we're going to be here for 2 hours. So I rely on our media team, Mohammed and Ali, to summarize it later. But what people need to know about it is that, Isron is an ethnic-led organization, and we're solely focused on serving Somali community, especially women and children. And this issue about housing is very dear to our team here in our community. And lately, some of the crises that we're seeing is really based on housing. So I appreciate making sure that our audiences, non-speaking English audiences, knows about it. But we're oral society, and we will make sure that we're going to summarize the issue that's happening here. Mainly, what I want to say is that this is the Our Homes, Our Voices National Housing Week campaign that we're going to be talking about is not really current. Like right now, it's not going to be a crisis for us, and we're going to explain that into writing. So we're going to get busy with Our Voice, Our Homes, and Our Voices. So here.
So right now, all around the country, are organizations, I think in every single state, that are promoting what's called National Housing Week of Action. The hashtag for that is Our Homes, Our Voices. And we are excited that this is an event that's going to be part of really a national movement to raise up housing and affordable homes as one of these issues that is most important. I think already we're starting to see changes happen with presidential candidates talking about housing, kind of big picture, folks thinking about how can we do something different, because it's just not working for people. It's not working for families. We have what is really a crisis. And it's not just a metro crisis. We're sitting here in Isarun's office, which is in Minneapolis, but this is something that we hear about all across the state of Minnesota and all across the nation. Rural communities, small communities, metro communities, kind of feeling the effects, maybe in a little bit different ways, but certainly feeling what this is about. So the National Housing Week of Action, one of the things that is encouraged is that people are encouraged to reach out to your member of Congress so that they know housing is a priority. Affordable homes is a priority. In the state of Minnesota, the majority of our housing dollars actually come from the federal government. Whether that be support for public housing, whether that be housing choice vouchers, and how those are spread across our state, one of the most important resources, whether those are federal tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, or other products that are part of how we either build or preserve or support residents with different products about how can we make that housing more affordable. One of the other things that's a really important component of housing is actually like heat and energy assistance. So I just want us not to forget about that. That is one of the most critical costs of housing sometimes, is how those costs increase. And again, there's some really important federal resources. LIHEAP is the acronym, but that come to local communities to be distributed directly to residents. In Congress or at the federal level, we're seeing what the federal budget is starting to be proposed. And the administration, the Trump administration, has proposed, as they did last year, what are some significant cuts. Very significant cuts. I will say last year we actually saw some increases in housing resources by Congress, and right now we're sort of in that process of seeing how that federal budget develops. The House has presented their budget, and it does have some significant increases to some of the housing resources, but this is exactly why your voices are important as part of National Housing Week of Action. And I wanted to turn back to Fartoon because you talked about how housing has become one of these points where folks in your organization are constantly working on folks on how housing is that entry point to how they need more help for their families. And maybe you can talk about that a little bit. I think one of the things we hope to do is kind of lift up what are we hearing directly from residents and from folks who work more directly, and that is certainly more from you and also from Michelle.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I just want to say in Somali, maanta waxaan ka hadlaynaa in dhibaatooyinka jirta guryo la'aanta Minnesota iyo sharci hadda in aqalka sare ay horyaala oo rabaan inay soo dejiyaan sharci la rabo in laga saaro 55,000 oo dadkan immigrant-ka cusub oon sharciga lahayn. Laakiin waxaan rabnaa ka hadalno midabta koorka guryo la'aanta magaaladan ka jirto iyo dhibaatooyinka guryo la'aanta ka haysata dadka madowga Soomaalida iyo qaxootiga kale iyo dadkan ka imaadaan Latineska iyo ka imaadaan Mexico ayagana qaxootiga Okay, so the housing issue, one of the biggest areas of our organization, and usually immigrants are really stabilizing them because they're refugees, they're coming in. The first thing they want to get in is a stable home because some of them are coming from refugee camps where they've been under tent for years and years and years. So the idea that they're struggling in getting into a stable home is also, it affects the kids' school system. It affects the stabilization of mom either or dad getting a job or getting any life of stabilization. And so with our refugee programs and every other thing we're doing about health literacy, system connectedness, we're unable to deliver services consistently because our audiences are moving consistently and their priority is zeroing in housing. And we're grateful to have a legal aid team here, but what we're seeing is that even if they're legally immigrant here, the discrimination of the housing is alarming, and it's becoming a high priority for us where even some families, they have to choose to buy a food for the kids or to pay the rent. And also, as you mentioned about heat assistant, we have someone now, an elder lady who has $900 of electric bill. She came for visa. Last night when I was at the mosque, some of the women told me and said, we have an elder who has this much of a electric bill that she's 60-year-old. I don't even know why she's keeping that bill, but there's so many opportunities that the community doesn't know. And also a lot of the community members are afraid about retaliation, and they're not even reporting. I think you've seen that, Michelle, a lot, that they wait the time of eviction or the breaking point where, mom and dad are really in a depression mode. So what we do usually is educate the community and say, don't wait until the end where everything is on fire and come back, and we're helping them. But the collaboration that we have to do, whether it's high policy level and local and us, is really upon us to really come together and say, how can we stabilize families? And one of the last thing I would say is, if someone is unstable in terms of the housing and the resources, they won't be able to do advocacy because they don't have the time. And that's what poverty does to people. And so then I'm grateful for your work in reaching out and trying to get the community stabilization and the civic engagement we do. 2020 census is coming up, and we've been absolutely all over the community saying every one of us have to be counted. So not only are we able to vote, but we're also compete for resources. So here's Michelle. You can talk about a little bit about what you do too.
So I can attest to the fact that people who are in transit in terms of immigration status, do not have a fixed immigration status, are in the process of obtaining immigration status, do experience significant housing instability. Before I started working for the city, I was an immigration attorney in private practice, and a lot of my clients, before they obtained immigration status, were in situations where they were living with family or living with friends, kind of crashing out on a couch. And when they got to the point that they were able to have a little bit of housing stability, they were still at a disadvantage because they were living in places that were, number one, too expensive, and number two, very unsafe,
Yes.
whether it be broken locks or bugs or
Lead
not.
poisoning.
That's right, or not heated sufficiently in the winter, or no air conditioning in the summertime. I mean, very challenging situations, and
Yes.
people just live with that. Like you were saying, they don't change unless they're forced to change. Sometimes unless they're actually evicted, and then they find new places. And sometimes, if those new places are relatively inexpensive, like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that this was out there. I didn't know that spending this much money, I could have an affordable place to live. So I've definitely seen that. And then in meeting with people in community, I have heard stories of people experiencing discrimination,
Yes,
not just in
absolutely.
private housing, but in public housing
Yes.
as well, against themselves and against their children, and being forced to do things that you would not expect
Yes.
that you'd need to have to do, like have their pictures taken or what have you. So I think these are very significant concerns, and the city wants to be responsive to these concerns. So if I would say one thing, it would be to encourage people to reach out to us, to reach out to the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, Department of Civil Rights, and legal service organizations if you feel like you've been discriminated against in the context of housing.
I think one thing I wanted to follow up is that when we say, people need to reach out and connect, that the most critical piece that organizations that like us and other immigrant-led organizations play a critical role, where if someone was able to go to Google and get your information and speak the language and do that, that we wouldn't have any disparities and we wouldn't have what's going on. So what I want to make sure that we're encouraged that organizations like us and other ethnic-led and community-led organizations and the city, we need to be like working in hand, because how information is received, many of our clients and our families, it's, do I feel safe to come to the place and then offer a cup of tea, how is everything going on, and you have to have a conversation to even pull out there is a crisis.
Yes.
And so that is also looking at how does different audiences receive information, and what that information is. It really, do they have a time to call different phone numbers, schedule meetings when it's really, I'm on a fire, I need you to put out that fire right now, and we are on that line. So making sure that we prevent eviction, we prevent discrimination. Many immigrants have been living in a horrific situation in refugee camps. Therefore, they would think it's going to go away. But then we see kids with asthma. We see a depression that is beyond treatment. We also see families that are thinking, I've been brought into America. I should take care of myself. I don't need any more help, because they're sick and tired of handouts and someone helping them. So the independency is very critical for them. So in a long story short is that we also need to figure out how to message, but also how to deliver in-person services versus just email or call or contact us.
So we might just, because I know folks might join us partway through. Again, my name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm with the Minnesota Housing Partnership. I'm here today with Michelle Rivero, who's with the City of Minneapolis Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. See, I remembered it.
It's a mouthful.
It is, I did it. And also Fartun Welly and Isarun is hosting us in their space, and so we are very grateful to Fartun and her amazing team. You can't see the whole team here, but I see a little bit more of the team. Yeah, and Laura, also from MHP, is here kind of supporting us. And making sure I don't forget embarrassing things. So anyway, we're having a little fun together. But if there are questions that people have, we're able to look and view your comments. But I just want to say there was one person who's actually our state contact with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, who just really wanted to emphasize the point that you made a few different times, Fartun, about how when you are in crisis, when you are in poverty, it is a privilege to be able to advocate.
Yes.
And so I think that's a message that all of us need to hear, It's about what are those expectations we have about how we are advocating, what are those different roles, and how can we really listen to what's going on and encourage our members of Congress that it may not just be the calls that come to their office, but how they are able to come out to community, engage with community, and understand those issues from working with organizations like Isarun and others. And I don't know if you have other suggestions for how we might encourage some of our members of Congress who are making these really critical decisions about federal resources to be able to understand, but also I think sometimes they want to know what are stories that help them make the case. You know, they are also out there advocating for Minnesota,
Yes.
and we want to help them make the case. And so what else would you like to say to them to help them with that?
Michelle.
Okay, so I can speak to this from the standpoint of immigration because trying to make the case for reasonable immigration laws is something that I've worked on for a long time. And since I started working for the city, the power of storytelling has really been elevated. And working with community organizations that have such close and trusted connections with community members, I feel that if community members are willing to share their stories, and if trusted organizations can help compile those stories, that is an extremely powerful way to convey information to elected officials so that those elected officials can, as you said, Elizabeth, take those stories and basically run with them, you know, and explain why our policies need to be different and our laws need to change.
So I'm known to be, keep it real. So we all, all of us work on a different level. So when, like we said, we're putting, how we talk to legislators, we did some, Suran did a lot, we work on a public policy piece. And it comes down to when someone has 8 hours a day, or sometimes we do 7 days a week we work here, when we're asking families to tell their stories, it's again, do I have the time to do it? Like, you're a widow, like one of the moms that I was showing you right now. She has 5 kids. Some of them are teenagers. She's a widow. She's brand new refugee. She works 6 days a week. She's only off Monday, right? And what that 6 days that she's doing, she pays the rent. There's no food money. There are no resources for the teenagers. That's why shout out to Children's Hospital and other groups who are just buying the Ramadan Eid gifts for them. So she doesn't have. She only comes one Monday here, and we say, did you pay the rent? Check. And then we try to cover everything else from the food shelf, from the generous money from Sewer Co-op, and then we figure out what else is there. She is absolutely would not want to just say, oh, I'm so poor,
Right.
or so I'm dying. And this is what the larger society wants to hear is how bad an immigrant's life story is, or how they need to be on a life support and tell that story. People are sick and tired of that. We should be talking about an empowerment that, hey, because maybe we paid $700, or we say, this is how you pay your rent. Don't fall off the cliff. And before you miss rent or before you get shortcome, this is a place you come, and this is a friend or a resource that you trust. Keeping that kind of a story of how a little bit of push
Right.
and support is helping this person to stand their own 2 feet. We want to tell that story. The deficit-based stories are actually what perpetuating people are not getting off the ground. It demoralizes people, and it's like, I've been in a refugee camp. I don't want to tell this story forever. So it's also us telling our legislators that, hey, look at all the smaller things that we're doing that helping people become independent. And so some of our families who have kids with disability, they're seeing the most discrimination. Families with autism, kids who are breaking some of the doors, they didn't even know there was disability rights. Gregor and our team have taught families that if you are a disabled kid, you have right A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Knowledge, empowerment, that's the stories that we really want to tell. And how we're going to work with legislators is really, maybe when they have time break, Michelle and Elizabeth, they can come meet with community, see how people are piecing their lives together other than how pieces are falling apart. So that will empower even us, and it will empower us knowing that you rather invest resources in putting people's lives together than people's lives piecing apart. And last thing I would say, immigrants are putting together millions and millions of dollars into the tax of our state and of our country. So even if 20% of the money were contributing to come back to us, that would have been amazing. So that was my long-winded talk here.
No, I appreciate that because we kind of get really hooked into this deficit-based language instead of really being able to tell those stories of like what are the contributions to just our society and to the economy and just all these different facets of life. Instead of always this, kind of downtrodden story, and which is not really about the reality. The reality is more about contribution, forward thinking, thinking about what's that next, what's that next, what's that next. Going back for a second to it being National Housing Week of Action, thinking a little bit about who represents us in the state of Minnesota. I don't know if we're...
Are you sharing those names?
Yeah, we might go ahead and put some of that in the comments, some of the names and phone numbers. But I think we actually really have a high number of members of Congress who have a sincere interest in housing. And so our ability also to think about how do we leverage that, how do we encourage them in their interest. I'll just tell a little personal story is that from my organization, we did an outreach a little bit earlier this year just to be able to share some information about housing. And we had participation from every single member of Congress's office in wanting to understand what is happening in the state and in their districts. So these are members on both sides of the aisle. And I just think that's important to know that they really wanted to have that understanding. We have, just thinking through, again, these names. So we have a senator here, our senior senator, Amy Klobuchar. She is running for president. If that is not a platform for encouraging her to think about housing from that perspective, that's really critical. Our junior senator, Tina Smith, she is very well placed on a very important committee that has oversight over financial services and how they relate to housing. So she is in a very important place in the Senate, in Congress, to be able to carry forward messages from the state of Minnesota about the importance of housing and how we finance housing and how it's available to residents throughout the state. And so I don't need to go through every person, but maybe as we continue for a few more minutes here, we can share a little bit. I wanted to turn just for a second, though. We were talking about how we need more Congress to understand. We need to up the ante here. And we need to, cuts is really just not even something we can contemplate for the United States when we think about this crisis of housing. But it's also important that we think about what are the policies that are being put forward. And recently there have been some rules that have been proposed. And sometimes those rules are proposed and they don't go anywhere. Sometimes you don't know, though, until you engage a little bit more. And so there's a recent rule that's been proposed by HUD. I think we should just at least mention it. Maybe I'll turn it to Michelle for a brief description of that. It actually, as we understand it, doesn't have a significant impact to families in Minnesota, but nationwide it does, and it's part of the message of Keep Families Together is a message that is being put out there about how we need to think about policy and these proposed rules at HUD.
So earlier this month, the federal government proposed a rule that has not gone into effect. that would impact individuals in public housing who are undocumented, where people who are undocumented would no longer be able to reside in public housing. From the research that has been done so far here in Minneapolis, it looks like 3 families may be impacted. So Elizabeth, as you were saying, like a relatively small number. This is in line with federal government proposed regulations and policy changes that may have an impact on people who apply for certain public benefits. And I can attest to the fact that the legal community in the Twin Cities area is extremely attuned to this issue. There are many nonprofit organizations, including Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid, the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, Volunteer Lawyers Network, that are meeting to make sure that the community is aware of these proposed changes, which it's important to stress have not gone into effect, to make sure that community understands what the proposed changes are, and to make sure that people who work with possibly impacted families know what the proposed changes are. So it is a situation that does cause fear when you read an article in the newspaper or hear something on the radio, and you're utilizing a benefit, whether it be housing, whether it be another type of governmental assistance, and you think, oh my gosh, I have to stop. It's important to know that these proposed rules have not gone into effect, and it's so important to communicate with an attorney, a public benefits attorney, and an immigration attorney. And if a rule does become a final rule where it is implemented, these legal service organizations will mobilize immediately to ensure that community, and in conjunction with trusted community organizations, to make sure that the public understands fully what the implications of any actual final rule is.
So, and just for folks, I am still figuring out my Facebook Live and how to make sure I see comments. I think I wasn't refreshing it correctly. So there's
right there with you.
yeah, so there's a few comments I just want to make sure I get a chance to read out. I think they're more comments that add to our conversation as opposed to being questions. But if I'm wrong about that, I hope that we'll get some more comments that correct me. So we have a few comments that relate again to this point about advocacy and what's the importance of that direct communication between residents and those who sometimes make the decision. And so there were a number of comments that came in from Lynn Soderstrom. She is, I will just say, in my opinion, a well-known advocate for resident voice, for resident voice being directly part of the conversation. And so she replies to a comment from Joseph Lindstrom about its important point that people don't have time for advocacy when they need all of their energy and effort for basic survival. And she replies, by that mechanism of sheer survival, we are kept separated and lacking support and awareness. And she also comments that prevention of eviction requires that we know the rules and regulations, which I think by implication she's saying that's not something that people generally have awareness of that detail. And then she had a couple of additional comments where she says, please stop asking us how horrible it was to lose our homes, and then running to Congress and telling them all about it without us. Our story is not your story to tell, thank you. When our stories are collected and curated to tell what our hell is, to tell what has happened, it re-traumatizes us every single time. So I just want to make sure that I had a chance to read those comments because I think that was an important part of the conversation that we're having.
So thank you. Was it Lynn?
Lynn?
Lynn, yeah, thank you. And I think that's amazing. And one of the challenges that we have, we assume that people know about regulations and rules. So families who come from the shelter here in Minneapolis, they inhabit moving into any apartment. And the apartments that these families have been moving were apartments that actually the city had put some laws to say, unless you fix, you cannot rent. Yet there's a middleman that gets these families rent that apartment. And they're awful, and lead poisoning, the place is horrible. And usually when families come in and we say, okay, what's going on? Because we do have our refugee health, ethnic self-help grant that we support with our families. And then when we do the assessment, we say, what is going on? And then every person is sick, mom is sick, the kids are sick, dad is sick, and is unable to go to his assembly work. And when we say, where is the contract? It's like, what contract? They, Gregor from the legal aid clinic will see the contract, and they've signed horrible things that are on the contract because the parents could be illiterate. They're desperate. They want to get out of the shelter. So there is a little bit of disconnect that we think everybody knows what the rules and regulations are. And I've signed many contracts without reading it because I was desperate for something. So community education is the key. So right now, to combat that, our refugee orientation program now consists in housing, any contracting. We do patients' rights, but now we added to housing rights. And any information is not small when you're new. And the last thing I would say for this is that we've talked about this community. People have to tell their stories, and it's not happening. We're still not connected. People, they just want to extract how bad people are hurting, and they tell their stories. Some laws are made or some winning things happen, but then the issues are the same. And I want to say this law that is going to evict 55 undocumented American kids and their families, I don't even know what to say about this. I hope everyone who's hearing, our legislators, both from both sides, both Democrat and Republican, that I hope this thing doesn't go anywhere. But it raises our consciousness that we already have housing disaster, both here in Minneapolis and throughout our state, that this also, the idea that this law can be even proposed, it drives us nuts. And talk about trauma. Yeah.
So regarding storytelling, the one thing I would want to share is I understand that it's traumatic to tell your story and to tell it over and over again. I have worked with people who are trauma survivors who are filing for asylum because they've been subjected to persecution. I know how difficult it is for people to tell their story. But I think that when people see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, from the standpoint of, if I tell my story, something's going to happen that is going to benefit me. I think that people take the time to do it. They make the time to do it.
Yep.
And I understand also the distilling the stories through or curating the stories, that takes away from the power of a person's experience. I understand that. So there must be a way to work together so that the people who are experiencing these situations are able to communicate in their own words what they're living and why they deserve to have something better or something different. And if we can help, however we can help, I certainly am up for that.
I've got another question here, but I just want to say, too, I think some of those comments, too, are about, the privilege that someone, maybe like me, who, is part of a system, has in sort of taking that and then trying to maybe shortcut time or those kinds of things to make a point, and in so doing, re-traumatizes the person whose experience it was to tell. And so I think that's a comment a bit more for someone like me or others like me who are in that advocacy space. And that sometimes you try to shortcut time or other mechanisms, and that's a privileged thing to do, and it doesn't serve the end. And think about that. So there was a comment that came in from Nasra, and I think it's a comment that goes back again. It allows us to kind of repeat a little bit, because her question was, okay, a lot of people struggles in a similar situation, so where do they go to get help? And I think we have some answer from both of you about what's a trusted place.
Okay, so I'll repeat again that I have worked for the city in the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for 10 months, and in that time, we have tried to establish relationships with trusted community organizations around Minneapolis. So one resource that I would suggest is our office, obviously Issaroon as well. We try to do community forums in different trusted spaces, whether it be Cedar Riverside Opportunity Center or this location, or Allow Assistance, for example, where nonprofit people who work at nonprofit organizations, including attorneys, other attorneys who work with the city, including the people from the Civil Rights Department. I go out as well, and other legal service providers and other community organization representatives come together to provide information to community and to answer questions that people have. And one of the things that we've noticed is that sometimes you'll just talk generally about discrimination, and a real issue will come up that the city is capable of addressing, and that will lead to additional conversations and taking additional information to kind of move forward from there.
So one of the things I will add is when usually housing crisis is happening, there are other things that are happening around the family and that. So one of the work that community-led organizations are doing is we're assessing what else is going on. Because yes, you want to put the fire out, but that person, when they walk in the door, is sit down, talk, have that conversation right away and say, map out that person's day life, what it looks like. And then the relationship we had with the attorneys and other organizations that have a specific area, that the legal area, but then the social service side is what we deliver. And so having that person sit that area and say, yep, we identified different problems, and problem A is illegal aid. Problem B is maybe we needed someone to make a call to the city or the governor or the Congress. So mapping that person's lives out with them and saying what are the root causes, how can we prevent and in either eviction or running short, or teaching them about this landlord, you has no right to evict you or this and that. It will be upon us to collaborate. Still, we're not there. It's really making the family and the community centered, and all of us being surrounded, and each one of us to do our 25%, and then 100% service can be delivered this family, where then eventually they need to be independent out of our services.
Well, we have been going for a while here with our Facebook Live event. This is part of Our Homes, Our Voices, the National Housing Week of Action. We are one event among dozens, at the least, that are happening all around the country, in states across the nation, which is really lifting up for members of Congress the issue of housing and making sure they know there is a movement, there is community that is demanding action, and helping raise up that issue for them. So I think we are kind of closing out our time here. Any last words that anyone would like to say? Again, I'll just maybe repeat. I'm Elizabeth Glidden. I'm with the Minnesota Housing Partnership. We work on policy issues, and I'm just really glad to have been hosted here at Issaroon and with my colleagues here, and I'll maybe let you each say a word of goodbye.
Yes, well, talk about community relationship and trust. If it wasn't Elizabeth, my answer for doing this would have been no. So you really have to develop relationship and be consistent and don't be transactional. Thank you. Here.
So again, my name is Michelle Rivero, the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, and I was very grateful for this invitation. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you so much, Fortune, for hosting at Issaroon.